Shall we begin? Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. My name is Jeff Thies. I am the director of the Institute for Business Ethics and Sustainability and of the College of Business Administration, and honored to have with us today also Dr. Larry Kalbers, who is an associate dean and the Archad Dreyer Chair in Accounting Ethics of the College of Business Administration. And we're going to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. We are really honored to be participating in the CSJ annual symposium, this focus on justice. And what we want to share with you is this international framework, which is really informing how we understand business and business education, really as an expression of justice and a direction to achieve specific outcomes and aims, both in business education and in business practices, really to advance justice. Sometimes people think that those things are a little bit in opposition to one another, that business is about financial gains and justice is really about right relationships and the way in which we live with and for one another. And so what I want to do is start by proposing that we look at this from an ethics standpoint, how we understand the purpose of economics and how that's reflected in something like the Sustainable Development Goals. So allow me to share my screen and then kind of show you the framework and the format about how we're going to have this conversation this afternoon. What we would like to do is focus on the ethics for the economy. And I'm going to share a brief video by Jeffrey Sachs. I'll introduce him in a second. And then we will look at the Sustainable Development Goals and then the ways in which that's engaged by business and the way in which it's engaged by the College of Business Administration. You'll see this many-colored circle here on your screen. That is an image of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, a driver in the development of the Sustainable Development Goals is an economist, Jeffrey Sachs. He has been an international economist for decades, and he is currently president of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is an initiative of the United Nations. A piece of that is also something called the SDG Academy, which is a place of many resources for Sustainable Development Goals and education in them. He is also a former executive director of the Earth Institute for Columbia University. And he has really from the beginning looked at not just at the dynamics of sustainable development and the importance of sustainability, but really he has always looked at the question of the ethics, really that drive how we think and the ethics that drive the way in which we engage, really the imperative of sustainable development. So let me share with you a presentation. It was really a discussion that he gave for something that was sponsored by the International Humanistic Management Association. This was earlier in the year, and he was invited in to speak about a presentation that he was going to be doing on an initiative called the Economy of Francesco. And he speaks about the need for really looking at the fundamental ethical assumptions that we bring to how we understand the economy and the functioning of the economy. And what he does is calls on the intellectual tradition, which really comes both through the Greek philosophical tradition, as well as a series of thought that ends up being expressed in the Catholic social teaching tradition, which he thinks is also reflected in a framework like the Sustainable Development Goals. And notice how he describes really the ethical aims of how we think about the economy and what it is that he proposes. So let me call that up right now. This will be about 10 minutes if you.
So I've been trying in my own thinking to reconstruct both what an ethics for our economy can be and how what we call, loosely speaking, neoclassical economics, which is the economics taught broadly speaking in most universities of the world and most textbooks of the world, has become such a strange entity, incapable of seeing or solving the crises of poverty in the midst of wealth, societies that are seeing a collapse of social capital, and the self-destruction of the natural environment. It's a long story that I hope to tell, and one of the things I'm hoping to do in the context of the economy of Francesco is write a couple of books about this, and I know Tony Annette is on the line, and we're planning on doing some of this work together, including a revamped principles textbook that would be on a sound ethical basis. I won't go through a formal presentation right now, except to say that most Western ethical thinking reflects a combination of Greek thought initiated really by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and Christian thought, starting with Jesus's teachings in the Gospels, and then the theology of Christian teaching from Augustine to Aquinas, and then the modern social teachings that really commenced with Pope Leo XIII and Rerum Novarum in 1891. And I think that the ethics that combines Greek philosophy and church social teachings is extraordinarily powerful. It gives a diagnosis of the human nature, of the search for well-being, as Aristotle called it, of course, eudaimonia or eudaimonia, and of the basic equality of human beings as created in the image of God in Judeo-Christian thought from Genesis onward and through the Gospels. And this is a very rich tradition, Western tradition, essentially, which I think can undergird a modern economic philosophy. But the economics that we have in place is not based on either the Greek thinking about the good, eudaimonia, or the church's social teachings and the essential equality and dignity of all human beings. It's based on a very different philosophical thrust, which I argue in an intellectual historical sense probably starts with the nominalism of Ockham, William of Ockham, but certainly in British thinking depends on Thomas Hobbes, who did not talk about the search for the good, but rather talked about the insatiable desires of individuals that leaves a society, or that leaves individuals solitary, brutish, and with a short life unless controlled by the Leviathan. So Hobbes's idea was not cultivating reason and virtue, but rather the inevitability of insatiable desire. And that notion of will or desire, uncontrolled by reason, I would say, is the British tradition philosophically, going through Hume, Mandeville, and ultimately to the invisible hand of Adam Smith. Because the underpinning of the philosophy is that we are each egoistic individuals with our personalized tastes. There is no human nature per se, there's just individual will. Our demands are insatiable. They can't be conquered by reason. And so what's needed is some combination of a state that to keep us from killing each other, that was Hobbes's idea, and a marketplace as the vent for our greed, by which, and according to the thinking of Mandeville and Smith, paradoxically turns greed into the common good through the workings of the invisible hand. And this is what I was taught in economics 48 years ago when I opened Samuelson's textbook. I learned that individuals are egoistic, self-regarding, will driven with given preferences that can be harmonized through perfect competition in the marketplace, and that each individual should maximize their individual will, and that in the end that would lead to a decent social outcome. I think the problem with all of this is that it doesn't lead to good individual outcomes, it doesn't lead to good social outcomes, and it doesn't lead to even survivable ecological outcomes. So the idea of the individual insatiable will being given free rein in the marketplace is a clever and wrong idea that motivates a lot of behavior, but actually greed ends up producing a lot of greed, a lot of criminality, a lot of inequality, and a lot of environmental destruction. And I believe that this philosophical idea of human beings as being inevitably and insatiably driven by desire is actually the flawed starting point that we have to remake in order for a new economics to work. So my proposal is that the Greco-Christian great synthesis of Western ethical thought is our starting point. And I believe that modern psychology and neuroscience add a lot to that and are fully compatible, I would say, with that, because they also show the common human nature, the need to cultivate reason, the need to control our worst impulses, the possibility of us controlling our worst impulses, the need to have moral reflection through rational contemplation, the universal dignity of human beings, and therefore their universal right to basic economic needs, especially in a world of plenty, give a different kind of economic foundation, I believe. And I'm hoping that a textbook, a principles textbook, will prove this, and it will certainly highlight many of the church's core social teachings. Not only the dignity of all individuals, but two crucial teachings, of course, the preferential option for the poor, and also the universal destination of goods, which is the church's doctrine that private property rights are not inviolable, that the rich owe to the poor what is rightly the poor's, that there are economic needs that are the rights of every individual by dint of human dignity, and that a modern economy can function by observing those economic rights and promoting human dignity. And so in essence, I believe that we have the basis for a new kind of teaching. And in this textbook, instead of starting with insatiable tastes and maximizing preferences, the book opens, the draft book opens with the human well-being and human dignity, and asks what is it in an economy that is needed to support human well-being and to ensure the human dignity of all.
So let me stop sharing there and go back to the PowerPoint that we were using. But you hear that fundamental discussion that he's asking about the economic system, which fundamentally suggests that we need a different way of thinking to understand the way in which we fundamentally need systems that are socially and environmentally responsible, and that really honor the dignity of each human person and see that in the kind of structures that we have both in society and in business. And so that is, as he would say, an ethical imperative, but it is also something that then needs to be reflected in some very specific planning. So in 2015, based on that kind of planning, the United Nations released the Sustainable Development Goals. And what it does is it takes this idea fundamentally of the common good and systems and processes that enable human dignity and it breaks it down into 17 dimensions. Now, my favorite summary for this, articulated by former CEO of Unilever, simply says that these goals mean no one should be left behind. And you'll see that they're broken into 17 dimensions. And in these goals, there are specific goals that directly speak to justice. Goal 5, gender equality. Goal 10, reduced inequalities. In Goal 11, sustainable cities and communities, especially with its focus on health and education disparities. In Goal 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. Of course, all of these are matters of justice. Poverty is an injustice. Hunger is an injustice. Environmental degradation is an injustice. But like I say, and also it's really important to think of the Sustainable Development Goals in their relationship to one another. But it is a taking of these dimensions, understanding their connectedness, and developing a strategic plan with measurables and deliverables related to that. So I would ask everybody who is on our call today to just do one brief exercise. I'm going to share a link in chat to the website for the Sustainable Development Goals. And what I'd ask you to do is to click on one and look at targets and indicators. We'll take about 3-4 minutes for this. You should be able to do this pretty quickly. But what you do is you click on no poverty or no hunger or gender equality. Click on any of the one that you would like, and then you'll see as you scroll down in the screen of your computer where it says target and indicators, and take a look at the specific tactics and deliverables that are identified for each of those Sustainable Development Goals. You should have all received that link. And as I say, I'll model this as well, just so you can see it. So as you scroll down here, if you can see my screen, and you see 17 goals, I'm on Goal 2 and hunger, and you click on that, and you can see how it presents both targets and indicators related to the goals. I'm asking you to see that just so you can see kind of the granular dimension of this. This is a strategic plan with tactics and deliverables and specific metrics related to that. It also, as you see, prevalence of undernourishment, for example. So this becomes measured related to end hunger. And then you can also see under progress and information, an annual reporting mechanism indicating what's working and what isn't working and what is the gap to be closed with these, what are at times called the 2030 goals. So let's just take a minute for that. I just want you to see kind of what's in the dimensions of planning. Okay. Well, the Sustainable Development Goals have two fundamental expressions in these initiatives from the United Nations. The first is something called the Global Compact, and that basically is an initiative to ask companies to commit to embedding these practices in their business strategies. And you'll see here the Global Compact principles. Notice this focus on protecting human rights, collective bargaining, eliminating any kind of forced labor or child labor within one's operation or supply chain. Stimulate practices that eliminate any form of discrimination. Again, that focus on justice, environmental responsibilities, socio-environmental responsibilities, the development and dissemination of environmentally responsible technologies, and the fighting of corruption, extortion, bribery in all forms. And so what businesses, and Dr. Kalbers is going to do a deeper dive on this so you can see the business application, but I want to share that the Sustainable Development Goals by Design have a business focus in this Global Compact initiative. And then they have an educational focus in the principles of responsible management education. And this then becomes the business school promise. We will develop the capabilities of students to be future generators of sustainable value for business and society at large, and to work for an inclusive and sustainable global economy. We will incorporate into our academic activities and curricula the values of global social responsibility as portrayed in international initiatives like the Global Compact. We will create educational frameworks, materials, processes, and environments that enable effective learning experiences for responsible leadership. This event this afternoon is actually one expression of that. You can see the rest of the initiatives that are part of the principles of responsible management education. In 2018, the College of Business Administration became a signatory to the principles of responsible management education. And so now I would turn our presentation over to Dr. Kalbers, who will speak about that initiative in its context.
Thanks, Jeff. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the College of Business and our mission and strategic plan. So our mission strategic plan represent the kinds of things that we're doing and formalize our commitment to these types of things. So it wasn't that we weren't doing things before we had this particular mission and this particular strategic plan, but this formalizes and sends a signal both to our faculty, to our students, to the community, and all of our stakeholders. So I just wanted to spend a couple slides quickly on first our mission. Our mission is to advance knowledge and develop business leaders with moral courage and creative confidence to be a force for good in the global community. So let me parse that out a little bit. Advancing knowledge involves both the research that our faculty does, but also the knowledge that we provide with students and for students. And by the way, students also create knowledge and advance knowledge as they do creative things in our classes, doing research, doing presentations, doing papers. We develop business leaders. So if you think kind of the Jesuit point of view that that represents that everyone is a leader all of the time, even though we're starting a business, starting a position, starting an occupation. We have people that watch us for signals and we watch others for signals. So we're always a leader. And so what do we want our leaders to be? We want them to have moral courage, which means sometimes you have to stand up for what is correct, what is ethical, what is morally valuable. And creative confidence, which means the confidence part, of course, is practicing, being able to do things, but the creative part is also being able to fail and learn from that. So to fall forward when you fail is an important part of that. The force for good fits perfectly with the Sustainable Development Goals and the UN Compact and the global community. So we're part of an entire world. We have a very unique and diverse LA community, and we also connect with the global community in many different ways. So let's go on to a couple of our pieces of the strategic plan. So our strategic plan has a lot of the goals and then tactics and sub-goals. And so in there, you can see that there's a couple places where we specifically mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're committed to those as business for a force for good, where business has a voice at the table. So we are saying that business is part of the solution, although sometimes it is part of the problem, that we think that we can be part of that solution and collaborate on those sustainable development goals. And then secondly, as Jeff already mentioned, we're a signatory, which commits us again in another way to those sustainable development goals, the SDGs.
So we became a signatory, as we mentioned, in November of 2018. We have, and we're just now in the process of sharing our information on progress. So being a signatory means that we're committed to embedding this throughout curriculum, programs, partnerships, research, and all of the ways that Dr. Calbers was speaking about. And then every 24 months, we need to develop a report for the United Nations, which is a publicly facing document showing what we've done, how we've advanced the work of the principles of responsible management education and the sustainable development goals, and what we're going to do to continue to advance that in the years ahead. So we are just in the process of finalizing our first and our inaugural sharing information on progress report. That will be made public probably over the next month. And you'll see a comprehensive expression of the work that we've done supporting the Sustainable Development Goals.
So as Professor Thies has kind of mentioned, we have both that perspective from how do we educate our students in the college and the university, but also what are the businesses actually doing out there? So I'm going to talk about a little bit about strategy, corporate responsibility, accounting and auditing, and then ethics. But I want to note that if you go to the UN Global Compact website, where it also has the SDGs, there are participants that are listed there, and participants are different organizations, including many companies and corporations around the world. And there are already over 16,000 participating companies and organizations in the United Nations Global Compact worldwide, and about 700 in the US, according to that website. So each of those participants makes a commitment to support UN Global Compact principles and SDGs. So let's go to the next slide to talk about strategy. So I just picked one example of this, and it's from a letter from the CEO, Mitch Boutier, who, by the way, is an LMU accounting grad and is the CEO of Avery Dennison. And so he sent this letter to the United Nations on September 28, 2020. So fairly recently, this is a new commitment by that corporation. So he writes, I am pleased, and this is part of a larger letter, I'm pleased to confirm that Avery Dennison supports the 10 principles of the United Nations Global Compact on human rights, et cetera. And we express our intent to implement those principles. So I've highlighted this. We are committed to making UN Global Compact and its principles part of the strategy, culture, and day-to-day operations of our company. So I want you to note that when corporations adopt this, and of course the proof is in the pudding, I'll talk a little bit more about measures, that they're taking this from the very top of that organization, saying we're including these ideals, these principles, and these sustainable development goals as part of our strategies, also part of our culture, and how we operate our businesses. So let's go on to our next slide. I also picked Gilead, and again, this was kind of random, although I know Mitch was there with Avery Dennison. Don't have any particular relationship to Gilead, but notice it talks about Gilead's ESG reporting. So these reports that corporations provide to the public and to their stakeholders have evolved over time. They used to be called sustainability reports. For the most part, now they are ES&G, which is environmental, social, and governance reporting. And as you notice, they're talking about a number of different external frameworks and reporting methodologies. So the GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative, has probably been the standard and around the longest that sets, here is how we measure many of these different things in terms of environment, social, and governance. Notice that they are referencing many of these. So now when we see many of these reports, such as Gilead or Avery Dennison or others, they actually are highlighting and referencing all of these different measures. So we can see the United Nations Global Compact, the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as some others. Another common one these days is SASB, which is Sustainable Accounting Standards Board. And so all of these are in these reports and show how are they actually achieving these different ones. So let's go to our next slide. So when you think about reporting or the value proposition, it involves stakeholders. So Gilead mentions with their CSR, their corporate social responsibility, who are their stakeholders? They mention internal stakeholders, which includes their operations, legal, tax, human resources, but their external stakeholders, which they divide into 4 parts: the investors and risk assessors, which includes obviously the stockholders and institutional investors, the rule makers and watchdogs, which could include the actual regulators, but also global NGOs, customers and community, those that they provide services to, which could be the patients themselves, the communities in which they reside, and also the healthcare providers, and then the peers and the business partners. So who are their suppliers? Who are their partners? And peers is an interesting one. If you think about peers, if certain industry peers are doing better things, are being more responsible, it kind of rubs off on the others, and vice versa, unfortunately, can be true. So the peers are actually stakeholders in multiple ways. As we said, as individuals, we might be leaders, but corporations are also can be leaders. Corporations are looking at what are the other corporations doing? What are their competitors? They're calling them peers here, but they're also competitors. So that also means a lot of this disclosure is something that companies are concerned about. What are they doing compared to their peers or competitors? And let's go on to our next one. We think about accounting and auditing. What are those measures? And so if we don't have measures, and I'm going to use this term greenwashing, a lot of companies have very nice pictures of what they do. I would argue that we want to look at what are the measures that they have, how do those get measured, and are they audited? So in this, Gilead talks about how they align their data collection, measurement, and reporting activities with these frameworks. And to some extent, those tie in with some of the things that they're required to report for the Securities and Exchange Commission and other external users. Let's go to the next slide. As I mentioned, pretty pictures are great. So when we see a picture of clean water or we have other things, that looks cool. But what is really important is what are the actual goals and measures, and that's sort of the accounting. So we see, for example, that they have a goal to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2025. And they're measuring how far along are they. Of course, a question we might ask is, according to whom? They're saying this. And as you can see, the red arrow talks about following third-party verification. So many companies, either as part of their normal audit or additional auditing, either done by their external auditor or by other third parties, they measure, they go in and they make sure that these numbers are correct and they verify those numbers. And so that's an important part. Just as we see audited financial statements, we are seeing more and more audited numbers in terms of these measures that are being displayed to us and disclosed to us. And let's go to the next one. And there's this other thing that's internal auditing. So companies that either contract out or manufacture themselves, such as a Nike or an Apple, or in this case, Gilead, they have their own audits within. So they have their own standards on sustainability and other measures related to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so they actually go ahead and audit their supply chain. And here they say that we oppose and condemn the use of child labor and forced labor, human trafficking, unfair treatment, et cetera, et cetera. The question is, how do they know that? And so they probably have third parties that go out and from time to time do audits of their contractors and their manufacturers to make sure that those things are true. And let's go to our next slide. So there's a number of ways to think about ethics and justice. Professor Thies has talked about a few of the particular sustainable development goals where we think justice is important in ethics. And there's various ways to think about ethical applications. One way to think of it is in the big picture. And going back to one of the original or early groups that talked about sustainability was the Brundtland Report back in 1987. It says sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. So the big picture is we should not be using up all of the resources, all of the good air and everything now because people in the future need it. And of course, right now we need to think about who are the ones that are better off or worse off. So we have to think about the now in terms of who are the ones that have access to certain things or don't. For example, with climate change, who are going to be those who are most affected and have the least ability to make changes that are meaningful. So we're all in this together on one hand, but we also have to be interested in the particulars on who is affected. So there are a number of ethical and justice points of view that we can think about as we think about sustainable development goals. And I'll let Professor Thies have a few concluding comments, and then we'll be open for some questions and
Yes.
hopefully some
Thanks
answers.
so much, Dr. Calvers. Yeah, the thing that I would just share is that we work to engage this question through the College of Business Administration in lots of different ways. And one of the things I would highlight is the Institute for Business Ethics and Sustainability. That, as Dr. Calvers had said, there's a number of initiatives that take place throughout the college and have taken place throughout the college, but they've been brought together in some specific ways. The new mission, the strategic plan, the lifting up of this institute to really focus on the moral imperatives of sustainable development. So that's why, as we looked at the sustainable development goals, we wanted to start with this focus on ethics and end with this focus on ethics. What are the imperatives that drive us, and what should those be? And how do we really embody that in the way in which we engage, how we think about business and what business practices are? So there's a number of different initiatives. Dr. Calvers was talking about corporate responsibility reporting and auditing related to that. We just recently did an interview with the Vice President of Corporate Responsibility for CBRE. That will be posted on our website shortly. She speaks specifically about this process. They're a global compact company. They go through a process of what they call materiality. So they determine which of those sustainable development goals are most pertinent to their business, and also which they can most effectively impact. She talked about the creation of science-based targets. So you'll see businesses that will measure not against previous performance, but set targets measured against the environmental impact measured scientifically. And she talked about the external audit function and basically the transparent validation of their reporting as another mechanism. The Institute for Business Ethics and Sustainability this week is launching for LMU students something we're calling the Promotion of Justice Challenge. And that is a competition that really focuses on business practices which advance justice and the storytelling of that. And you can see on our website the particulars of that. We've got a couple of information sessions related to that. But basically, it's a process to identify a business and a business practice that really advances justice. Then tell that story through a program called Aim to Flourish. And then the 4 top teams will be given the opportunity to work with mentors to basically design a video to highlight the story of that corporate practice advancing justice. And anyway, it's really meant to emphasize the business practice, to tell that story, to produce a professionally developed video presentation of that. There's cash prizes involved for students. We want this to be an energized challenge, but really about lifting up business practice, because one of the questions that we receive consistently is, a lot of this sounds really good, but does business really do this? And a lot of this sounds really good, but how does it show up in business? And a lot of this sounds really good, but really, doesn't business kind of fight against this? And so I'd wrap up by simply saying that sometimes we think that there is profit and then there's purpose, and somehow they are in competition with one another, that they're in competition when we have investment strategies, they're in competition when we develop corporate strategies. But what you see evolving in the area of corporate responsibility, really expressed through these global compact companies, is that we need to understand, and successful businesses recognize, that it's not profit and purpose, but it's profit through purpose, and really to express the really the social and the environmental responsibilities of business as a key mechanism for profit generation, really to create the kind of thriving environment that honors human dignity, as we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So let's end there and really just open it up. If you have any questions or anything that we can do to talk more about any part of what it is that we've been sharing, please enter them in chat, and let's have a few minutes for question and answer.
Yeah, there's also a Q&A or chat. Either one is fine.
That's right. Thank you.
While we're waiting for all these great questions, let me just share my screen for a second on something that I think is useful to see. So we mentioned that these companies do need to be very specific. So this is also for Avery Dennison. So we can see here that they actually absolutely identify these goals. So for example, here we see goal 8, human rights, and it talks about what their policies are. Similar to advancing circular economy, goal 12. And then over on the right, they show where they have links either to actual data or to their policies. And so in some cases, these are just policies, but also procedures that they do to make sure that they're doing those things. So these companies are doing a lot of detailed reporting, and I think that's helpful. The more specific they are and the more the measures that they have. So it looks like we do have some questions coming up.
Yeah, so first I would say, how many business schools? That's a good question. I don't have an exact number. It's in the hundreds. This is an international initiative. I would refer you to the Prime website. It's unprme.org, and you can see all of the business schools, both domestically and internationally, that have signed with the Principles of Responsible Management Education. You can see their reports, so you can see the specifics of what they're doing related to that. What I had said about profit and purpose, it's to say that, traditionally, when you'd ask people, what's business about? What's about making money? We have an expression that's really unfortunate, but it says, I had to make a business decision, which basically means I needed to prioritize money over everything else. Now, money and profit, of course, are critical, because without profit, you don't have a thriving business. So I'm not trying to diminish that in any respect. I'm a former business executive. I worked hard for profit for years. But what you find increasingly is, instead of organizations thinking about this conflict between profit and purpose, what they're doing instead is saying, we need to understand that it is profit through purpose. So are the Sustainable Development Goals 17 categories of responsibilities, or are they 17 categories of opportunity? If there is the profound commitment and need to the decarbonization of our economy and moving toward really renewable energy sources, what are the business opportunities inherent in that? If you look at the Los Angeles Green New Deal plan, they call it Plan LA for the city of Los Angeles, they see a focus on renewable energy as a jobs program for the city, for example. So again, it just the encouragement to not think of these things in opposition. Dr. Calvers, maybe the question about business schools using these principles?
Yeah, so I think we are seeing, I don't know the exact number, and maybe Professor Thies knows the number that are prime schools. Do we know that number?
It's at least 1,500 internationally, and I'm thinking somewhere in the 400 range in the United States. But
yeah, so that's a pretty big number. So we're not unusual in that respect. I think we do it extremely well because of it relates to our mission and what our faculty and our leadership and our staff believe. But it is becoming more common. There have, thinking about business again, last year, a lot of CEOs committed to this bigger scheme of things. Again, my concern is, let's see the numbers, let's see the measures, And so we are seeing a lot of companies stepping up. So I think this is, in a lot of respects, kind of the new business atmosphere. If we go back to the 70s, where Milton Friedman said the only thing companies should be doing is making a profit, I think we've seen, it's taken a lot of years. I guess that was like 50 years ago, but we are seeing a change, I think, both in business and business schools.
There's one additional dimension I would share to our audience, which is that we are a Jesuit business school, and we are part of an international association called the International Association for Jesuit Business Schools. Our dean, Dale Smith, is a board member of that association. There's a United States-based expression of that, Colleagues in Jesuit Business Education. But the International Association has worked to articulate a new paradigm in business education, which is absolutely parallel and reinforcing and complementary to the Sustainable Development Goals and the principles of responsible management education. And so this is a collaboration among Jesuit business schools in a specific and unique way as well. And you'll see that throughout the Jesuit network, both domestically and internationally.
I'm looking at the Q&A. Usually I would answer my dean first, but I'm going to go to students first. So let's see. Samantha Wilson asks, is CBA offering specific classes focused on sustainable ethics and equity? So we have a core course, the B Core 4910, which focuses on these things, which actually Professor Thies teaches, and some of the students are in this class. We also have some standalone electives, both in the undergraduate program and the graduate program. And in addition to specific classes, we do have these topics kind of threaded throughout many of our courses. And for the accounting students, we have a separate accounting 4150, which includes many of these topics. Professor Thies, do you have any other comments about that?
No, I'm just reflecting, and maybe it relates to that question about expanding on the idea of profit through purpose. So I shared with that course, Business Ethics and Sustainability, a presentation by Paul Pullman of Unilever, and he was focusing on sustainable development and the Sustainable Development Goals. And he basically said there's 4 business rationales for this. So the first one is top line growth, that it fuels. He said that they're socially and environmentally kind of targeted companies. Ben and Jerry's is one example, as a Unilever company, that they outperform those that don't. So it fuels top line growth. You also see a focus on risk and risk management. You're seeing this a lot. BlackRock, Larry Fink, his annual letter came out a couple of days ago about the requirement to incorporate risk calculation into how we think about investing, and environmental risk, social risk, et cetera. The reputation dimension of this, Dr. Kalber's talked about greenwashing. If a company is saying that they're environmentally responsible and they're not, that fuels a bad reputation as opposed to a positive reputation. And then increasingly, talent acquisition is another key driver. People want to work for companies like this. And so those are 4 business benefits that really unite profit and purpose, profit through purpose, as one example.
Yeah, along those lines, I mean, the investors are demanding more of this information. So it's not just to Professor Thies's point about risk. They're concerned about, well, what are you doing about climate risk? If you're Coca-Cola and you have water for the bottling plants, in a place where water is scarce, that doesn't make sense. So investors want to know, not only from a business perspective, but an ethical perspective, what is it that the companies are doing, because that adds risk.
Another question, Dr. Kalbers, from our Q&A?
Sure. So here's one from David Young. What are the most challenging roadblocks that hinder sustainability goals for companies?
Sometimes there's structural challenges. If you're in a kind of industry that needs to change or kind of repurpose itself, think of challenges in the oil and gas industry, for example. So sometimes there's structural challenges. Sometimes another challenge is that businesses are committed to this, But if you look at it from the outside in and ask if they're making the kind of social or environmental impact that we need to see, you might say they're saying the right thing, maybe doing the right thing, but this isn't moving fast enough. And so that's another kind of challenge. And then another challenge, although you're seeing movement on this, is the commitment of leadership. What you really see in the most successful organizations is the CEO and the C-suite really are committed to this. They own it, and then they advance it. If an organization kind of delegates this to a VP level or mid-level, you take care of the sustainability stuff, and then produce a nice report at the end of the year, and it's not part of core strategy, then that becomes an impediment as well, I'd say.
And that actually answers another question by Carolyn. What is a common theme you see in businesses that are ethically aware? I also want to mention, when I talked about competitors and peers, a lot of times that competition does drive the profit motive. And therefore, if some companies are not sustainable or not acting in that way, it is more difficult for those competitors or the peers to do that. So in fact, to some extent, legislation is important. And even some companies like to have legislation because that evens the playing field. So if everyone has to have certain goals, say for MPG for automobiles, it doesn't mean I have to suffer compared to my peers or competitors because the government is setting that goal. So sometimes we think that government regulation might improve or not improve, the business climate, but actually a lot of businesses favor regulation of certain kinds to enable them to be more sustainable and to be not at a disadvantage to their competitors.
Another question?
Let's see. Luis Torres, does your final purpose to try to be an organization that could certificate other business schools in sustainability, ethics, and equity? So can we provide certification? And I'm not sure that that's our goal as a prime. It does sort of go along with our dean's question about working with other schools to get the word out. In addition to getting word out, how do we work together across university to make meaningful impacts? So kind of across organizations and within our organization, how can we improve things?
Well, one thing that strikes me is that we certainly want to continue to develop for our students their capacity and specific skill set to become the kind of leaders that we've been talking about as a foundation of Prime, to bring sustainable value to business practices throughout your career. So that question about how that gets reinforced and the mechanisms for that, whether it's a certificate or what have you, is an important focus for us. But our initial work really in the strategic plan has been to really have this be foundational and embedded throughout our business school and our curriculum and our practices and the examples that we hold up. So you'll see things like marketing for good, for example, and the specific pitch competition that they do, that this year they're focused on the sustainable development goals. You'll see a lot of programs and curriculum kind of activities that are focused on the sustainable development goals or dimensions of them. Again, think of social equality, environmental responsibility, et cetera. And so it really is by design meant to be more kind of organic and infused throughout, in addition to specific classes that focus on the details of it.
Thanks. So I have a question from Casey Joseph, our ITS person. If the current economy supports egoistic behavior, how do you, in practice, alter the collective mindsets to create a culture of ethics similar to what Dr. Sachs described?
Well, that's a great question, which is why I wanted to start with that brief discussion or video that we posted, because it does require a different way of thinking. And from my perspective, the fundamental question is, are we fundamentally united with one another and the environment within which we live? Or are we basically pursuing self-interest? And If we think in terms of pursuing self-interest, that really is not consistent with what the foundational understanding of the Sustainable Development Goals are and the philosophical traditions that Sachs talked about, that focus on the common good and fundamental solidarity. I think the COVID experience teaches us that we're fundamentally all in this together. If you look at public health models, for example, epidemiologically, we're connected. The globalization reality of the ways in which we're so interconnected. There's a philosophy in sustainability thinking called panarchy, which basically looks at the way in which we live together in nested integrated systems. There really is not a way that we can effectively think them and us. It really is just us. And so we have to focus really on the proper functioning of that. And then how does that get designed into business practices, the design of business products, all of these kinds of things. So the first step is really, why do we think the way we think? And shouldn't we be thinking differently? If that can be embedded, and there's different ways that we seek to do that, then that informs how we think about business and how we really work to plot out the impact that business can have in the decades ahead. And so I think it is that internal work. Sachs said that deep reflection, to think deeply, to think philosophically, and then get to work. It's really the combination of both those things.
Thanks. We're getting short on time, so I'm going to give you a question to answer, and I'm going to put the QR code up while we do that for those that are under CBA Advantage. So this is from Ethan. How do we shift sustainable and environmentally friendly goals from being an option to businesses into a standard?
Would you like to start with that, Dr. Calbers? And you want me to?
Yeah, you do that, because I'm going to put up the QR code, and then I'll be happy to share.
I showed for my students a presentation that Pullman gave 2 years ago to basically a group of CEO investors. And he said, you know, I'm really pretty frustrated because people keep asking me, why do you do what you do? Unilever is designed around their sustainable living plan as their core business strategy. And he said, how come you're not asking other companies, why don't you do that? How is it that we're not responsible in using all of our resources for that impulse that fundamentally says no person should be left behind, that any structure or system within which anybody is left behind is a fundamental injustice, to go back to the key theme of our gathering this afternoon. And why don't we create a climate where that is the expectation of business? We will talk about the moral agency of business, the way in which business is an ethical actor and has both the opportunity and the responsibility of acting ethically. But we tend to see that, again, it goes back to that kind of frame and mental model that we have, that if business does good things and makes money, then boy, that's a kind of icing on the cake, instead of the fundamental reality that this is the responsibility of all. And that should become our standard against which we measure both ourselves and the businesses and business overall.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, you know, sometimes legislation is useful, but also it is what the culture of different corporations are, and it's also what, you know, the stakeholders demand. And more of us, more of the investors are demanding that companies pay attention to these. And so if you look at all of that together, it builds a culture. Even legislation is part of the culture. What it is that we believe in as a community is reflected many times in our laws, but also in the way we do things. So I think it's a combination of culture, demand from stakeholders, and legislation.
Yes.
And let's see, maybe we can do one more question. This is from Kaya. Are there any examples in which having sustainable goals enhances a company's competitiveness rather than alters it?
Yeah, I just shared an example from Corporate Knights. They just identified, this was in class last week, actually, they just identified the top 100 performing companies according to their corporate responsibility scale. And the top 100 companies outperformed from a net productivity standpoint those companies had more women, 1/3 more women on their boards, talking about justice and gender equality. So you're seeing the best performing companies embracing this. And I would just advise you to look at Corporate Knights, their top 100 list, and you'll see specific examples of that. And one of the things that was interesting to the students when we talked about it is these are companies throughout the globe. And you'll see them in China, in India, in Europe, in the United States, Latin America. So it's an international expression.
So we have only one question left in Q&A, so we might as well do that, and then we'll close it up. This is from Rohan. Profit will always be the goal, but not necessarily monetary profit. Agree or not?
Well, my students have heard me say this. So I come from a $5 billion nonprofit. Every organization needs to generate profit because without profit, it's dead. And so profit's critical. A nonprofit doesn't pay out dividends to shareholders. A nonprofit reinvests the profit in the mission of the organization and in the community work that they're responsible to. But every organization needs to generate profit. The question is, at the service of what? And is profit the goal, or is profit a tool for something bigger and greater than itself? Now, responsibility to shareholders and rewarding investment risk with equitable returns, all of those things are important. Again, not to diminish any of that, but it just is to say that profit needs to be seen as a mechanism toward a greater sense of responsibility and engagement. So you'll hear a movement from shareholder capitalism, which prioritizes the investors and their return, to focus on stakeholder capitalism, which works to understand the kind of the commitment of value to a broader network of stakeholders. That was the business roundtable expression that Dr. Calvers referred to earlier. He appropriately said, it looks good on paper. Let's see, the proof is in the pudding, as the old expression goes. So, so we need to see how businesses live up to that. But you certainly see that kind of movement, which really prioritizes something greater than just pure profit.
And just a final comment to that, to add to that, which is I think that focus on stakeholders. You see a number of companies such as a Johnson & Johnson that focuses on the stakeholders and the community. And their belief is that if you spend the time focused on your stakeholders and do right by them, you will become a profitable company. So it's the question, which drives which? Do we try to make a profit and the afterthought is the stakeholders? I would be a believer of that. If we do the right thing for the stakeholders, recognizing, as Professor Thies says, we have to stay around, we have to survive, which means we have to make money. But if the focus is on the stakeholders, over time, if we provide a good value to our stakeholders and our communities, I think we will be profitable.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a complete honor and pleasure to be able to share this time with you. And any final words, Dr. Calvers, as you lift up the QR code?
No, I think that I thank you, Professor Thies, for your leadership in this at the CBA and at LMU, and thank all the participants for joining us today. And I did have the QR code up. I'll put it up one more time before we leave. Whoops, and that's not it. So,
for those who are not CBA students, this is part of our program called CBA Advantage, which is a way in which students are able to essentially track and archive all of the different activities that they participate in through the College of Business Administration and create an e-portfolio, which helps them upon graduation and in their job search processes.
All right, I've just lost my QR code, but I think it was up for about 3 minutes before, okay. So everybody should be okay.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone. A real pleasure.